Since the beginning, the United States was founded on the lie that African American slaves fighting among revolutionary soldiers would be given their freedom. Following independence, it wouldn't be until 1804 that most northern states would officially abolish slavery. The southern states held on to the practice for half a century longer. By 1861, the American Civil War had torn the young nation apart. The national lie had finally been exposed. From 1776 until 1861, the nation tried in vain to grip with the issue of slavery. The House Compromise of 1820 allowed statehood for the Missouri Territory and postponed the Civil War and delayed the inevitable expansion of the U.S. This is the beginning of the story of the Missouri Compromise. During the Constitutional Convention of 1787, delegates were called to form a new constitution that would create a new frame of government for the struggling Confederation, maintaining the balance of power between the free states in the North that advocated for the abolishment of slavery and the slave states in the South was one of the most difficult issues. The question of the United States continuing the practice of slavery would not be solved at the convention. Each side fought to keep the balance. The Southern representatives wanted all slaves to count for representation in the new Congress. The Northern states felt this would give too much power to the Southern states. James Wilson proposed the idea that African Americans should be counted as 3/5 of a person for the purpose of representation in Congress and taxation. The Senate was agreed to be 2 representatives per state in a bicameral legislative branch. The result was 12 senators and 30 representatives in the South versus 14 senators and 35 representatives in the North. With the addition of 5 new states, by 1812 the balance of power was even in the Senate. 18 senators in the South versus 18 senators in the North. Congressional approval was needed to admit new states, but both sides were reluctant to tip the balance to the other side. States were added in pairs, with Indiana and Mississippi admitted in 1816 and 1817. Alabama and Illinois admitted in 1818 and 1819. This maintained the balance of power, but it also never answered the question of what kind of country the United States was to be. While the world was abolishing slavery, the Southern states were content to maintain the status quo, and the Southern states were too afraid of the consequences of following the example of the European continent. In 1818, the first territory west of the Mississippi River applied for statehood. When the statehood bill for Missouri arrived in the House, James Tillmadge, a New York representative, offered an amendment to prohibit slavery in the new state. Tillmadge proposed that no more slaves be brought into Missouri, and that the children of slaves already there be freed at age of 25. This proposal started a debate in the House that lasted almost a year. Supporters of Tillmadge's amendment argued that the proposed amendment was constitutional. The Constitution gave Congress the right to admit new states into the Union. Therefore, the supporters argued that Congress could also refuse to admit new states unless these states met the conditions demanded by Congress. John W. Taylor referred to Indiana and Illinois, where their free state status conformed to anti-slavery provisions of the Northwest Ordinance, which prohibited slavery in any part of the state formed from the Northwest Territories. Opponents argued that Congress did not have the right to impose conditions on a territory to become a state. This argument would be tested 39 years later during the Dred Scott v. Stanford. The House narrowly approved the amendment bill, with a vote that reflected the nation's growing divide. The Southern representatives realized they were outnumbered in the House. The fight for the House of Representatives that the 3/5 compromise sought to avoid had finally been settled. The balance of power was now focused on the Senate. When the bill arrived in the Senate, pro-slavery senators immediately struck out the offending amendment. The House refused to concur with the Senate's version of the bill, as they realized adding a new slave state without an opposite free state would give the power to determine the destiny of the slavery in the Senate. With this, Missouri's first statehood measure died. 2 years later, Missouri renewed its application for statehood. Once again, the debate over how Missouri would be allowed to enter the nation stirred up anger and bitterness over issues of slavery. Even the Three-Fifths Compromise, the balance of power of Congress was tipping towards the northern states and was being maintained by an even split of senators, 22 representatives the North and 22 representatives the South. Each side understood that the two new senators could possibly determine the fate of slavery in the nation. The Northern anti-slavery faction wanted to reintroduce limits on slavery in the new state, similar to the Tillage Amendment a few years before. The Northern state leadership continued to argue that the Constitution gave further generations the legal tools to sustain the removal of slavery, including the refusal to admit additional slave states. They argued that the founders of the Constitution sanctioned slavery with the impact understanding that the slave trade would end in 1808, and the slave states would take steps to end slavery as opportunities arose. The Southern state representatives refused to consider any amendments that would limit Missouri's ability to have slaves, and accused Northern states of inciting riot by Southern slave populations. It seemed that Missouri would have a hard time joining the Union, and in order to preserve the Union, it might remain a territory indefinitely. In February of 1820, the District of Maine, still wary from the British occupation during the War of 1812, obtained approval from the Massachusetts legislature to introduce new legislation seeking for congressional approval for statehood. This would finally separate the territory from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and ease fears of British annexation. The admission of Maine as a free state met with the same opposition that Missouri received. Henry Clay was the representative from the state of Kentucky since 1810. While Clay was an advocate for gradual emancipation of Kentucky's slave population, he generally sided with the Southerners' slave faction. At the time, he was known more as a political agitator than a pacifier. It was rumored widely that he'd advised the Missourians to abolish slavery gradually by state action. Nevertheless, he vigorously supported the Southern proposition that slavery within a state was a subject for local and not congressional regulation. Henry Clay promoted a compromise originally introduced by Senator Jesse B. Thomas of Illinois that would allow slavery in Missouri while simultaneously admitting Maine as a free state. The proposed compromise drew a line from east to west along the 36th parallel, dividing the nation into two completing halves, half free, half slave. Henry Clay used his power as Speaker of the House to appoint members to a House-Senate conference. Then he used parliamentary procedures to call separate votes on these three parts of the deal. This prevented Southern representatives angry over the Thomas Amendment from joining with Northern restrictions to defeat the package. The House passed the compromise bill on March 2, 1820, which was secretly rushed to the Senate to prevent motion to reconsider. The final bill was signed into law by President Monroe on March 6, 1820. This landmark compromise allowed Missouri to enter the Union as a slave state, Maine to enter as a free state, and the abolition of slave states north of the 36th parallel. While many worried that the country had been lawfully divided along sectional lines, Southerners used the Missouri debate to justify slavery. They claimed that the speeches in Congress revealed that there was no place for free blacks in the United States where they could go and not be degraded. Northerners worried that the compromise was a Southern victory because Missouri was admitted to the Union as a slave state, and the territory south of the 36th parallel would give the Senate an additional 6 senators. The Missouri Compromise maintained a delicate balance between free states and slave states until the introduction of California in 1850. The Compromise of 1850 let the people of each territory decide the issue of slavery. This helped delay the American Civil War for another decade. In 1854, the provisions of the Missouri Compromise forbidding slavery in former Louisiana Territory north of the 36th parallel were effectively repealed by the Popular Sovereignty of Kansas-Nebraska Act. The result was the immigration of pro- and anti-slavery citizens into Kansas. The Kansas Territory eventually rejected slavery during its application for statehood. This further divided the nation and directly led to the American Civil War 7 years later. The country would split along the 36th parallel and fight for 4 bloody years.